Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on January 9th, 2026. Last night, Russia struck Ukraine with its Oreshnik missile. The Oreshnik is an intermediate-range hypersonic missile. It's believed to travel at speeds exceeding Mach 10 and is capable of carrying multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, as well as nuclear warheads. Before last night, the Oreshnik had been used only once in combat, in November 2024, when it struck a large industrial target in or near the Ukrainian industrial city of Dnipro. Last night's strike occurred near the Ukrainian city of Lvov, which is only 70 kilometers from the border of Poland, a NATO country. There's some speculation that the strike targeted the Stryyi gas storage facility, the largest underground gas facility in Europe. And at this point, we're not in a position to verify that that is, in fact, the target. We do, however, have a video of what appears to be the Oreshnik strike taken from a distance. Now, Russia's defense ministry says that last night's Oreshnik strike, which was part of a much larger series of strikes on Ukraine's energy system, was retaliation for a recent Ukrainian drone strike or attempted drone strike on a residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin. But the strike comes only one day after the U.S. Navy seized 2 oil tankers sailing under the Russian flag. One oil tanker was seized in international waters in the North Atlantic. The other was also seized in international waters, but nearer to the Caribbean Sea. And predictably, these seizures provoked a strong rhetorical response from the Russian government. All of this is happening in the wake of the Trump regime's criminal assault on Venezuela and its kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. In other words, there's a whole lot of escalation going on, at least to the naked eye. Now here to discuss all of this with us is Margaret Kimberly. Margaret is the executive editor and senior columnist of Black Agenda Report and the current host of the Black Agenda Radio podcast. Her book, Prejudential Black America and the Presidents, was published in 2020, and she also spoke in May 2024 before the United Nations Security Council on the dangers of weapons transfers to Ukraine, a controversial topic in the West, to be sure. And she is a recipient of the Serena Shim Award for Uncompromising Integrity in Journalism and the Women's Institute for Freedom of the Press 2021 Women in Media Award. Always a pleasure to speak with you, Margaret. Thank you for coming back onto our program.
Oh, it's great to be back, and Happy New Year.
Our best wishes to you and to our audience members for 2026, despite its inauspicious beginnings. So, Margaret, I'd like to start with the Trump regime seizure of these Russian-flagged oil tankers. Trump claims they were seized by U.S. forces because they were believed to be carrying Venezuelan oil, as if that provides some sort of legal or moral justification for their seizure. But at least one of them, I understand, it was found to have had no oil in its cargo. And even if they were carrying Venezuelan oil, Margaret, the Trump regime must have understood that Russia would react very negatively to these seizures and might well view them as a serious escalation. Do you think that that is the administration's intention, to escalate the West's war on the Russian Federation?
Oh, absolutely. And I have to tell you, I one of the things I first thought of, there are people who still repeat this trope of Trump being Putin's puppet. And my first thought was, can we stop that now? Can we stop? He's doing what every American president does. He is ratcheting up U.S. policies of, they call it primacy, that the U.S. has to have primacy in the world. There can't be any rivals internationally, and any country that potentially can counter the U.S. has to be diminished in some way. So this is a continuation of U.S. policy done Trump style. Right after the attack on Venezuela and kidnapping of the president, the U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, posted that, mocking the Russians, something, you're your defense capabilities for Venezuela didn't mean anything. I'm paraphrasing. But I thought to myself, do they really think no one in Moscow is listening to this? Do they really think nobody in Putin's administration cares about a U.S. official, the Secretary of War, in fact? It's such a silly name, Secretary of Defense. I'm going to call him that because that's what the agency ought to be called. That he can mock another country. So, no, I'm not surprised that the Russians have responded. We had this a drone attack on Putin's residence carried out by the Ukrainians. And anything Ukrainians do, the U.S. is helping them do. The CIA runs their intelligence. All of their defense capabilities are in the hands of the U.S. So anything Ukraine is up to, the U.S. is also involved. So first you're going to send drones to Putin's house. Then you're going to seize a Russian tanker in violation of international law. I don't know why we talk about international law anymore. Clearly, it doesn't mean anything if countries are allowed to violate it. And then, of course, the Russians respond with these Oreshnik missiles. And this is all very, very dangerous to me. But I thought of another thing. I thought of the UN resolution on Gaza, which Russia and China could have and should have vetoed. And I think their abstention was just seen as a sign of weakness. All the excuses about why they couldn't, after coming up with all these arguments as to why it was a terrible thing to abstain instead of veto, this going along to get along with the U.S. is clearly not working for them. So that was a thought I had as well. And I think I went off on a tangent. Did I answer your original question?
You did indeed. And you added a lot more meat on the bones. Thank you for that. And so that kind of brings me nicely to my next question to you, which is we've heard a lot of discussion about the new national security strategy, or as I like to call it, the national insecurity strategy. And some rather charitable interpretations of this strategy have amounted to a claim that the Trump regime, and I'm going to call it a regime, I can't bring myself to call it a government or administration anymore, that it was, envisioning a kind of retreat of U.S. forces from the non-Western world, and it was going to ensconce itself firmly into fortress Western Hemisphere, and this was going to be the new Monroe Doctrine, or as Trump likes to call it, the Donroe Doctrine. What is your take on all of this, Margaret? Do you think the United States government has given up on its overarching goal of global hegemony and will content itself with dominating the Western Hemisphere?
No. Well, I wonder if people have read the same thing. I was like, that's not the impression I got. There's a lot of wishful thinking with analysis of that document. But in one way, the United States has chosen to start at in its own hemisphere, so to speak. Can I start about this Monroe Doctrine business as if it's some sort of legislation or international law? James Monroe, 200 years ago, said the Western Hemisphere belongs to the U.S. and no other powers. Europeans have to stay out. In 18 whatever, I can't remember the exact year. And people act like it's a real thing. It was just this statement of U.S. aggression, and people act like it's something that's supposed to give some guidance to us today. So, but it has in fact been U.S. policy to intervene all over the hemisphere, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, to undo any state that chooses an independent path, that chooses to stray out of the American fold. It's most extreme in places like Cuba, so close to the U.S., where a socialist revolution succeeded. And for the past 60 some odd years, every president has in some way, only Obama, he reestablished diplomatic relations, but that was undone by Trump. And Biden went along, by the way, saying Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. So there's always a sustained attack on Cuba. on Venezuela. Even tiny kind of little Grenada's little Caribbean island, which doesn't even have 100,000 people, that a short-lived revolution, and they sent in the Marines, killed the president, the prime minister, and made sure that didn't happen again. So this has always been U.S. policy. Now we have Trump, of course, intervening openly in elections in Honduras, in Argentina, to frighten people into voting for the people that he wants to be in power. So this is part of a long U.S. Tradition of exercising control in the region. I can't forget Haiti, where the U.S. kidnapped people. Act like this never happened before. I was like, I remember President Aristide being kidnapped by the U.S. So this Donroe Doctrine is U.S. doctrine, Trump being Trump, magnified. But so the U.S. has decided to start right here in this hemisphere, in the hemisphere where it's located, and making sure that there is no ability of other nations to be outside of the U.S. sphere of influence. And unfortunately, because nations are physically here, they are subject to U.S. attack. So even if Russia or China wanted to help Venezuela, it's the U.S. that's closest with the strongest military. And so we're going to see more of this. We're going to see the U.S. and the U.S. has, in attacking Venezuela, has undone the sovereignty of other neighboring nations. So Guyana next door, and Trinidad and Tobago right off the coast of Venezuela. They have these puppet governments, very happy to be under U.S. influence, allowing the U.S. to install radar and military equipment. So the U.S. is disrupting the affairs of many nations in the Western Hemisphere. That's always been the case, but we are now seeing it done in a faster and a more intense way.
Sorry about that. I had my mute on. So let's focus a little more on what's happening in Venezuela, Margaret. And I'm just going to put up on the screen here a report that the BBC published on January 7th that the general in command of Venezuela's presidential honor guard, Javier Marcano Tabata, had been sacked days after President Maduro was seized by U.S. forces, sacked presumably by the new interim president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez. There has been a lot of debate in the alternative media, not so much, interestingly, in the corporate media, about whether or not President Maduro was betrayed. And we've talked about that claim considerably on this program. And I wanted to get your views on this. You know, the focus of people who are taking this position that he was betrayed is the fact, or the apparent fact, that when these U.S. military helicopters swooped into Caracas, they appeared to encounter no meaningful resistance from Venezuela's multi-layered air defense systems. Mm-hmm. And there's also some indications that members of the presidential honor guard were murdered, principally 32 Cubans, intelligence officers and military personnel who were there, I understand, to protect or help protect President Maduro. But somebody like me, who has long been a fan of Chavismo and its socialist project, I find it difficult to stomach that claim. But as a journalist, I feel obliged to keep my mind open about it. What is your take on all of this, Margaret? Do you think President Maduro is likely to have been betrayed? And how, if so, how deep do you think the betrayal goes?
Well, it's possible. I mean, you can't say it isn't true, but I've been trying to warn people about, first of all, this need to reach conclusions right away. I mean, this all happened in the early morning hours of, it was the 3rd, Saturday. And right away, people said, well, he must have been betrayed. I said, you don't know anything yet. What is this? What is your, this is conjecture. And it's unserious to me. That's the other thing that bothered me. People who I felt should have known better. Also, you can be repeating U.S. state narratives. This is a moment to be, if you were in solidarity with the people of Venezuela, with their right to have the government of their choosing, this is not the time to speculate, especially since it's speculation about how this was carried out. I also think the U.S. has the world's most powerful military. It's not hard for the U.S. to snatch somebody and take them out. They turned out the lights. They turned out the electricity in Caracas. I'm sure they have the capability of shutting down a defense system. That's not hard to believe. So, yeah, but the CIA is the CIA. They do what they do. So I can't say that there was no double agent. There was no betrayal of Maduro. But I do wish that that people would, first of all, just wait. You don't have to know everything right away. What is this conjecture based on? And this general who was sacked, people are saying he's in jail, that the new interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, has arrested him. I haven't seen any confirmation of that. He has been removed, and she said, "Thank you for your service." But people are repeating over and over again that he's been arrested without any confirmation from any source that I trust. So it's something else people need to stop saying. I mean, could it be true? Yes, it could possibly be true, but you don't really know. Mm-hmm. And so this urge to comment when on specific details when you could not possibly know yet has got to be stopped. And if you're in solidarity, if you're an anti-imperialist, which I am, what you should be doing now is picking apart the U.S. narrative. You should be in critique of the U.S. and its allies trying to justify this aggression. You should be in support of the Venezuelan people. And if you're independent media, you need to remind people that the U.S. Venezuela has been a U.S. target for decades. I was there in 2023. I was invited to join a fact-finding mission on U.S. sanctions, and I already knew this, but I saw for myself how the U.S. destroyed Venezuela's economy. But we see this repetition. Well, it used to be prosperous, now it's poor. Well, why is it poor? The U.S. made it almost impossible to sell their oil. They had this amazing resource, which they couldn't use anymore, depriving Venezuela of medical supplies, of medications, of food, snatching their diplomat, Alex Saab, who was trying to break the sanction and save the lives of the Venezuelan people. And this is not mentioned in corporate media, or you get this, this liberal, fence straddling. Well, they shouldn't have done it, but we know Maduro was a dictator. We know he was a narco-terrorist, just repeating the narrative from the U.S. state. So people need to stop. This is a moment to give analysis, to give history, and stop the guesswork, stop the conjecture, because it's something that just plays into the hands of the Trump administration and U.S. vassals around the world.
Margaret, I'm so happy I asked you this question because you're the first person I put the question to who answered it the correct way, in my opinion. I just, for what it's worth, my own view is that it's certainly possible there was a betrayal, but it's also possible that there was not a betrayal, and quite apart from solidarity. And I completely agree with your sentiments about solidarity if you're an anti-imperialist, but just as a matter of journalistic integrity. Yep. To run around and claim to a virtual certainty that this man was betrayed. If people are saying this, even people who are military experts, I think, aren't justified in saying that they know. But I'm hearing this from people who aren't even military experts and who really don't understand the U.S. capability to, for example, suppress air defense systems. I don't purport to understand it. Right. But until we have hard evidence that there was a betrayal, real hard evidence, I think that the the approach of solidarity is precisely the one you've outlined. So let's talk about the new reality in Venezuela. We're being told by Donald Trump that little Marco Rubio is now running the country. What do you make of that claim, Margaret?
Well, he's not. The Venezuelan state is still intact. I don't know. It's hard to know what they thought was going to happen. I suspect they anticipated a complete collapse of the government if they snatched Maduro, kidnapped the president, let's use that word. And I guess they believe, their own propaganda that he's a dictator, and if you get rid of him, the whole thing will fall apart. Well, it hasn't fallen apart. There is an interim president, Delcy Rodriguez. People have been coming out in mass in support of their government, of their sovereign rights to have the government of their choosing. And yes, they did. And people need to stop talking about an election that Maduro stole, when in fact all the evidence shows just the opposite. There's no proof of that either. But there is an intact state. So they're not running anything yet. Now, the problem for Venezuela is the U.S., they still have this carrier group parked outside of their country. They still have the capacity to disrupt, to attack, to bomb Venezuela, to keep them from sending or receiving oil. But they have not taken out the state. And this is, the Bolivarian Revolution is more than 20 years old. So you have this revolutionary process in place for a very long time. And so, no, they don't. Marco Rubio does not run Venezuela. They have the power to be very disruptive. They have the power to do great violence, but they are not running Venezuela. I also think it's important for people to acknowledge what I just said. People there support their government. They do. And there's this belief in, I guess it's a U.S. exceptionalism that no one else is really committed to a cause. People are committed to their politics in Venezuela. And people who don't know anything about Venezuela, everybody's an expert overnight. It could be about someone being betrayed or the nature of the Venezuelan state. But people need to admit their lack of knowledge, frankly. But no, they're not running Venezuela. So it's unclear what I think they anticipated a complete collapse, a complete capitulation, but they have not gotten that. Life is going on in Venezuela. So no, as of now, they are not running Venezuela. It will be very difficult for them to do so. And people need to stop. It's a funny thing, even people who I think should know better, if you repeat something often enough, they just believe it. Well, he's a dictator. If you take him out, it's all over. But that's just not true.
Yeah, I just want to point out, as many of our audience will know, I was actually in Venezuela last year at the invitation of the governing Socialist Party to act as an election observer. And I was there with, I would estimate 150 people from around the world who accepted a similar invitation. And we went to polling stations on voting day, and we saw no indications of intimidation, electoral fraud, anything of that nature. In fact, the system seemed to be working very smoothly, very professionally. That doesn't mean I can guarantee people that there weren't any shenanigans. I just saw no evidence of it, and nobody that I spoke to saw any evidence of it. And I also just want to put up on the screen here, Margaret, because you were quite right to highlight the sanctions. There was a study published last year by The Lancet, which I was taken aback by this figure. It showed that from 1970 to 2021, U.S. sanctions killed on average over 1.5 million people. It was something in the range of 540,000 people around the world. And could you talk to us a little more about what you saw on the ground in terms of the impacts of sanctions, U.S. sanctions, Western sanctions on Venezuela?
Yes, we our group visited a hospital, a children's hospital, and in the days, especially the days of Hugo Chavez, the reason, one of the reasons the U.S. hates Venezuela is that they were using their oil wealth to help their people. How about that? And Venezuela actually was a magnet for healthcare for the entire region. I personally know people from Trinidad. People would go from Trinidad to Venezuela for healthcare, to have surgery of various kinds. So, but when the U.S. and sanctions, I think people don't understand what that means. They think it means you can't open a bank account in Caracas, but it's far more serious. The U.S. cuts off the target from the world financial system, and there is no exception for food or medicine. So if people need cancer drugs, if doctors have to have special equipment, a physician there was explaining to us, if you do heart surgery, you're supposed to have there's an instrument, a chest spreader that you're supposed to use for any heart surgery, but they can't buy it. The U.S. won't allow them to purchase this equipment. So they have to use a scalpel and sort of do a makeshift chest spreading. I mean, it's horrible. Food. I mentioned Alex Saab being kidnapped because he was finding ways to get around these sanctions and get food into the country. So, and you could tell that things didn't quite work well, simple things like faucet or, all kinds of little things. You could tell they just didn't have the supplies to upgrade equipment and to fix the little things that you expect to have working in a modern country. But that was the thing that made the biggest impression on me, that Venezuela can't buy medical equipment, can't provide on cancer drugs. If someone needs to have not a stem cell transplant, bone marrow transplant, I mean, it's very expensive, but the equipment and the drugs you need, they can't get. So that means people die. So there was already a study showing, I think it was 40,000 people being killed the first years of the first Trump administrations there. What did they call it? Really bad sanctions. I can't remember what their term was. Maximum pressure. That's right. Really bad saying. Maximum pressure. That 40,000 people had been killed by that. So people need to understand what sanctions really do. And any country that wishes to break the sanctions is itself sanctioned by the U.S. So it's just gangsterism to say, I'm going to beat you up, and if anybody comes to help you, I'm going to beat them up too. And that there's so many, and it's not just Venezuela, it's Cuba, it's Iran, it's Eritrea. There's so many, like a third of the countries in the world are subject to some level of sanctions from the U.S. And when the media don't talk about that, then you're lying. It's war propaganda on behalf of the U.S. state. If you don't tell people, yes, Venezuela is poor now because of the U.S. And I think if we're going to talk about that, it's very, very important to hammer that home, so it's harder for them to spread these lies.
Yeah, and just to underline, the outcome of the Lancet study, 540,000 people per year from 1970 to 2021. We're talking about 25 to 30 million people killed. This is comparable to the death toll that the Soviet Union experienced in the Second World War. So we're talking here about Nazi-level horror, to be perfectly blunt about it. Margaret, he's now threatening Trump to expand his overt regime change operations throughout much of the Americas. Cuba's in the crosshairs, Nicaragua, Colombia, even Mexico, Canada. He says he wants to be turned into the 51st state. He calls our prime minister governor. There's been a lot of chatter about Greenland. What do you think is next, Margaret? And do you think that there's any stopping this man at this stage? I mean, it seems like there will be no consequences to the United States for this naked aggression against Venezuela. Where do you think this is all heading?
I like to be more optimistic. So I'll start with my optimism. I do not believe that this regime change plan in Venezuela is going to work out the way they think. That's the first bit of optimism that I have. The U.S. I think people need to be careful about saying the U.S. is a weakened power, and yeah, things aren't working out quite as well as they used to, but the U.S. is still very dangerous. So I for one, am hesitant to use that kind of language. The U.S. is the dominant military power. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency. So the U.S. president has a lot of power. So if they want to take Greenland from Denmark, a colonial, very racist country. I have to say this about Denmark. I'm sorry. I know you didn't ask this, but Denmark, Greenland is the home of an indigenous people. They're very much oppressed by Denmark. Denmark has used forced sterilizations, takes people's children in Denmark. They have this policy. They say they don't want to create a ghetto, but basically they decide where you live based on your race. So they've said, well, X number of people from global South nations live in this neighborhood, so you can't live here anymore. That's segregation. That's discrimination. So I want to say that about Denmark, and Greenland should be independent of Denmark. And Denmark is one of these, they've been the most anti-Russian countries. The prime minister is always talking about Russian invasion. So F Denmark, frankly. I just felt the need to point that out about that horrible. People think it's, social democracies, they got free healthcare. Yeah, they do. But it's a horrible country and a little U.S. puppet. And despite having been a puppet, is going to be slapped down anyway. But no, the U.S. should not be trying to snatch Greenland. But who knows? They may. No one with the power to stop Trump will use it. A lot of these policies are bipartisan. It's a difference in degree, a difference in how to carry them out. But this attack on Venezuela, for example, is an impeachable offense. So, yes, the Republicans are in the majority in Congress, but a member of Congress, a Democrat, could file articles of impeachment. You could do it, but they don't want to do it. So what have Democrats, let's talk about what they've been saying about Venezuela. They usually take Maduro's terrible. They take that tack, but he should have come to Congress first, then asked us. I believe if he'd gone to Congress and asked them, they would have said yes. But so they have the power to stop him. The American people are this narrative of American exceptionalism. Unfortunately, it takes hold with most people. Even people who don't like Trump, who criticize him otherwise, will say, well, Maduro was a bad guy. So there's no popular will to really, there's a lot of complaining, but and even large scale mobilizations like the No Kings, that's a Democratic Party get out the vote effort. It's not really effective in my opinion. So the people who could stop him don't. And if people want to talk about fascism, you get fascism when you have a weak liberal class, and that's what we have in the United States. So he can get away with anything almost. I think there would have to be a real catastrophe for people to finally turn against him, those with the power to turn against him. You would have to have some catastrophic military defeat, or the economy tanking, or something like that. So it's unfortunate that he does have the power to act on this madness. And lest we forget, the ruling class, it loves it. And I want to say something else about Venezuela. China is also the target. China buys oil from Venezuela. So if you deprive, and that's always a goal of U.S. foreign policies, to encircle China, to choke off their economy. So they have the ability to do those things. So this is a very a challenging moment, but I also believe, as I just said, that there are people outside of the U.S. who will confront the U.S., and these attempts at regime change are not going to work out as they planned.
Yeah, when it comes to Denmark, I'm going to call and raise you and say fuck the EU, but that's just me. So I want to
Me
come
too. Me too.
back. So just as you were speaking, I received some late breaking news. I put it up on the screen here. At least it's news to me. I don't know exactly when this emerged, but apparently the Donald, in an interview with Fox News, talked about increasing military spending by
Right.
600 billion in the next year in one fell swoop. Do you think? I mean, if it wasn't such an extreme increase in it, Margaret, I wouldn't even ask you this question. I would just assume the answer is yes. But because it's such an extreme increase, and given the level of indebtedness at the U.S. government level currently, do you think that this particular increase might finally attract significant opposition in the U.S. Congress, or do you think they're just going to rubber stamp this too?
Well, they're the Congress. They're all errand boys and errand girls for the ruling class. So if the billionaires, the real billionaires, not like Trump level billionaires, if they say, "Wait a minute, this is too much," then it won't happen. I mean, that's the reality. The military budget's almost $1 trillion now. It's 900 billion. It is most of discretionary spending in the U.S. I mean, at the same moment that they are ending subsidies for health care, which will talk about killing people, just as sanctions kill people around the world. This crazy effort to kill Obamacare is going to kill people right here. But in any case, they this effort to almost double an already gargantuan military budget could be the last straw. It could be the last straw for the economy. It could be the last straw politically. Trump, I have to say this about him. People are afraid of him. So Republicans are afraid. I mean, he's a vindictive, petty man. So people are afraid with some reason, but they lack all principle. And of course, if people stood together, they could thwart him, but they refuse to even try. So, the budget, that was always a Republican talking point, right? We're not tax and spend like those liberal Democrats. We're the ones who will cut the budget, unless of course it's the military budget. So Trump's supporters, it's hard to say. There are among them true believers. They don't care what he does, but there are others who voted for him because they thought he was going to screw someone else and not them. So, but members of Congress, unless somebody turns off the spigot of funding for their campaigns, they may grumble amongst themselves. They may face angry constituents, but they will keep going along. And Democrats will, just as they've done with Venezuela, they will try to find some mild criticism of him while going along. So it's possible he could get it. I think things would have to be really bad in order for him not to get what he wants. And Trump they also have an amazing media apparatus. And I say it with some grudging admiration, where they keep people in lockstep on any number of things. Of course, the corporate media, they always want to be friendly with an administration. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, they are, at the end of the day, they are going to go along with anything that he says. But their apparatus for social media is quite amazing, not in a good way, just to be clear. But so they can keep people in line. They can keep Republicans in line. And the Democrats they're just chicken shit. They're not serious in any way about really fighting him, because they're also the errand boys and errand girls of the ruling class. So things can get worse. And also, I think, one of the worst things about Trump, when Democrats get back in, and eventually they will, I am betting money, and I'm not happy to say this, they won't undo what he's done. There'll be some rhetorical changes, some, around the edges, but they won't undo what he's done. So, they may not be, this, a barbarian like he is, and build a ballroom in the White House and spend millions of dollars and tear half the building down. They probably won't do that, but fundamentally, they won't undo what Trump has done.
This actually brings me to the domestic policy issues I wanted to talk to you about, and particularly the horrifying events in Minneapolis this week. Yesterday, we did a lengthy report on Reason to Resist about the shooting by an ICE agent, or as I prefer to call him, a fascist pig, of a 37-year-old woman, mother of three, point blank range, 3 shots to the head, causing her SUV to spin out of control, and in a residential neighborhood. I'm sure you saw Margaret, the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey. I presume he's a Democrat. I didn't check, but he got in front of the microphone, and to his credit, he used language which was, I thought, entirely commensurate with the gravity of the crime, and said to ICE, "Get the fuck out of our city." And then you had Tim Walz being somewhat more diplomatic, but he announced that he had issued something called a warning order for the National Guard. And there are 2 ways one could interpret that. One could interpret it as we're going to take control of our streets back from ICE and aren't going to tolerate this anymore. Or it could be we're going to put the National Guard on notice in case the protests become too unruly, and we're going to use the National Guard to suppress those protests with force if necessary. He didn't clarify which of those 2 things he meant.
No, he didn't.
So I'd like your overall reaction to what happened in Minneapolis, and whether you think in particular that this might finally galvanize broad-based opposition to this regime's merciless persecution of immigrants, and finally cause the Democrats to put up some real opposition to Trump's immigration policies.
Well, it'll be the people who show any real opposition. It won't be the Democratic Party. The Trump, they are prioritizing ending immigration from the global South and getting immigrants out of the country. So they have come up with this quota of X number of people need to be detained every day. And of course, in order to keep up with that, you have to just snatch anybody off the street. And the Supreme Court legitimized this. It's racial profiling. So people who are Latino, people who belong to Native American tribes are just being snatched up. Anybody who might look foreign, have an accent, they're just snatching them. And the Supreme Court said, well, if you check and let them go right away, it's all right. So they have, unfortunately, the legal authority to do that. And they are, in order to do this, they have to rapidly expand the number of these ICE cops. I don't even want to call them agents. They're just cops. That's all they are. Like, they have done away with their background check, fitness checks, experience. I mean, just any goon who wants to be trigger happy can now work for ICE, giving signing bonuses, paying them good money to behave in that way. So it was inevitable that this was going to happen. They have focused on Minnesota. Trump's pettiness, I believe a large part of it is the fact that Governor Walz was Kamala Harris's running mate, and he can't forgive anybody, whoever runs against him. So first it started off with these, this overblown story about fraud in Somali daycares. There have been people charged. These cases go back a few years, though. This is not new. There were individuals involved in fraud, but they have now targeted the Somali community, most of whom first began coming to the U.S. as refugees in the 90s. Most of them are U.S. citizens. But because the Supreme Court says that racial profiling is okay, they have, many of them who are actual citizens of this country, have been targeted. Now they're talking about, and he said in an interview with the New York Times, and he mentioned Somalis specifically, denaturalizing people. Denaturalization is very and should be very rare. And up until now, it has to be because of some material fraud in the citizenship application. But now, if Trump doesn't like you, they are prepared to take away people's citizenship and get Black and brown people out of who've immigrated out of the country. So we're seeing, for a variety of reasons, we're seeing Minnesota now be the focal point for his targeting of Democratic-run cities. He's killing several birds with one stone, targeting Democratic Party officials, targeting Black and brown immigrants, targeting somebody who ran against him, all at the same moment. But it's going to have to be the people. And we've seen in many parts of the country, that's how that poor woman ended up, Good, I believe was her last name, ended up being killed. People have stepped up to try to protest these actions. That people don't, most people, and that's another reason for optimism. There are millions of people who don't want this, and they are telling us, with their small efforts, scattered efforts, to try to stop these ICE raids. But what we're going to have is a disconnect between the people and the electoral system. Because as I've said, it's pretty clear that no one who actually has the power and authority to stop Trump is going to do it. And so it's going to have to be some sort of mass uprising against him. It's going to have to be popular. And so this is an indication of where that can lead. And Minnesota is a test case, I suppose. But this, these takeovers of cities, sending the National Guard to quote unquote fight crime, it's nothing but racial profiling and terrorism. And so immigrants aren't the only target. The targets are anybody who dares to, in any way, protest against them. But it's going to have to be the people who do it.
And I think it's fair to say that if the people do it, there's going to be some heads broken, some limbs cracked,
and shot. Yes.
Yeah.
She won't be the only victim, sadly.
Yeah. So I'd like to conclude our discussion by talking about what I think can fairly be described as a civil war within the MAGA movement over support for Israel. And just so people know, when I originally invited Margaret onto the program today, I wanted to focus on one of the figures in this civil war, Candace Owens, but there's been so much, of momentous importance that has happened in the time that Margaret kindly accepted our invitation that we relegated this to the last item for discussion today. So just so you know, Margaret, before Charlie Kirk was killed, I had never watched Candace Owens. I think I'd heard of her sometime. A few times I'd heard her referred to in the alternative media, but I really didn't know who she was. I'd never heard of Charlie Kirk before he was killed, which may be surprising because apparently he was quite an influential figure in the Republican base. But then when he was killed and Candace Owens started really aggressively dissecting the FBI's narrative about how he was killed, and I think really insinuating, if not outright alleging, that Israel had a hand in its murder, I started watching her program just to see what she was saying and try to get a sense of how this was affecting the conservative movement's thinking about Israel and U.S. support for Israel. And I just watched last night another episode in which she said basically that that Israel has infiltrated the Christian movement in the United States, has infiltrated it, and is effectively poisoning the minds of Christians so that they'll support what is a genocide. And she's been very clear about all of that. And I guess my question to you, I'm interested in any reaction you have to this civil war. And it's not just Candace Owens, of course. It's Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon has said some critical things. Even Megyn Kelly has said some critical things about Israel. How much of an impact do you think that people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are having on right-wing support for Israel in the country? Is this a tempest in a teapot, or is this a real threat to support U.S. support for Israel?
Well, it's interesting. the only people there are very few people in the U.S. who support Israel. There are very few. Congress goes along because of the Zionist lobby and their power, their political power and their financial power. They have bought people off. If you go against them, then suddenly you find yourself facing a well-funded opponent. So let's just be clear about how, Trump will say it, sometimes his little outbursts are very telling. He's like, I got $250 million from, what's her name, Adelson's widow. So the U.S., Israel is an important part of this U.S. quest for primacy around the world that we discussed earlier. So I don't want to say the U.S. wouldn't support Israel if it weren't for the Zionist lobby. The U.S. would. But what has happened in the past 2 years is that because any decent person is appalled by Israel starving people, bombing hospitals, this fake ceasefire, the goal of which was just to take Gaza out of the news, withholding aid. People are freezing to death in Gaza, but there's shelter piled up, food piled up at the border, and Israel won't let it in. So all of these, this makes Israel a pariah in the minds of most people. Most people don't like Israel, don't want Israel to have as much sway as it has, to get as much money as it gets. And that is true across the board. Now, the MAGA people and they're no exception to this either. And people can, I think, deceive themselves. So Trump says, I don't like war. And I'm like, come on, you already saw him. Every president likes war. It's very insidious. They know the people don't want it. That's why they say it when they run for office. But people convince themselves that Trump was this peacemaker he made himself out to be. But they're now angry or disappointed. So I think this brouhaha between, Candace Owens and others is a reflection of this break that many people have in the MAGA movement. But again, the political system isn't going to help them. Electoral politics isn't going to help them. Now, since it's not in any way a movement I have any connection to, it's hard for me to say exactly what is going to happen or who killed Charlie Kirk. It's very murky to me, that whole thing. But Candace Owens was a true believing right-winger, a Black woman who was always critical of Black people. I'm no fan of hers. She insisted that, oh God, what is the gentleman's name? Black man who was killed in Georgia, just hunted down by a mob and shot in the street. Ahmaud Arbery, that he should have been, she implied he should have been, he wasn't just minding his own business. He should have been shot. So that's the role she has played in the right-wing movement, giving them cover, because as a Black person, she will be supportive of them. So it's going to be interesting to see what's going to come of this. But there was always this tension in the Republican Party amongst this, people use the word populism, for lack of a better way to express it, I'll call it populism, and the establishment Republican Party. So it's something that's always been there. But a lot of these people who have a big audience are finally speaking up. I think Israel is the straw breaking the camel's back. But Israel, as I said, is an important part of U.S. foreign policy. So they don't care that Tucker Carlson is asking hard questions about U.S. support for Israel. As far as they're concerned, he can be an enemy as much as someone with my politics if they feel he's reached too many people. I don't know who killed Charlie Kirk. Candace Owens can go off the rails saying Macron's wife is really a guy and she's trans, and I don't know. That was a whole foolish thing in my humble opinion. So I don't pay attention to her I don't pay attention to her. She said, George Floyd died of drugs, not because the cop, had his knee on his neck. She's a crazy person. and acts against the interests of Black people. So I'm not concerned with her as such, but I think this is an indication of a break of tension. And it's hard for me to say what will happen, because I think that most Americans are in the sway of one of the two political parties. How many people will really buck the system? That's the question. And I think, like a lot of Democrats who will fold up if the Democratic Party establishment tells them to, I think that's also true of Republicans as well. So it will be interesting to see if this really, if this is a real shift in the dynamic.
Well, it certainly promises to be an eventful year, to put it mildly, Margaret, and I hope we can have you back onto the program numerous times between now and the end of it, assuming we make it to 2027. But
I'll be optimistic. Who knows in what condition we will be in. It's a pivotal time, and I'm happy actually to see it. But we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And but yes, I would love to come back and talk to you again.
Thank you. And for what it's worth, I too am optimistic despite all of the grim news. I think the overall trajectory is the right one, and that justice will prevail. In any case, we're signing off today from Montreal, Canada, for Reason to Resist on January 9th, 2026.
Thank you.